Hello and welcome back to another Tech Nugget brought to you by Coking.com. I'm Evan Hyde. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to be talking about the bud, the bottom unheading device, to the coke drum flange connection. Now, this is a very large flange connection in almost all coke drums in the world. This is a 60-inch connection. Very big, very complicated joint to get made up properly and reliable for the long term. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First off is the installation of this system, and we're going to talk about one of the most obvious things, which is make sure that the coke drum flange is completely flat and is perfectly round. This seems obvious, however, we have seen instances when brand new coke drums have come from the factory and they may have been perfectly flat, perfectly round when they left the shop, but oftentimes they have a long journey from wherever they were fabricated to your site, and they can get a little bit distorted over time. There is some level of tolerance that is acceptable, but this can be discussed after you've found some deviations. Hopefully you find none. Now, we also know that after a coke drum has been in operation and you drop the bottom unheading device or bud for maintenance during your turnaround, drop it down, move it to the side, fix it, bring it back, you may notice that again during operation you can have some ovality or unflatness have occurred over time during the operation. Now, this is something that again you can repair with on-site machining. It's not easy, but it can be done. So again, make sure that you check the surface of that bottom of the coke drum, because it is more likely to be out of round, out of flatness than the bottom unheading device. Now, you should also check that as well. However, that's a much more compact piece of steel with much more reinforcements, more material there, less likely to get seriously deformed. So second point here for the installation is obviously make sure that the gasket is in good condition. This seems kind of obvious, but we have seen instances where gaskets have been damaged in transport. It is a very large, very floppy gasket, and when you're sort of moving it around or lifting and getting into place, sometimes you can get little nicks in it. And those, of course, can compromise this seal. So make sure the gasket is in good condition. And then last point for installation, we're going to talk about thread dope. Now, thread dope is very important to this system. You should apply it liberally to every single bolt. For the bolts that go down into the body of the bud, the so-called blind studs, those bolts should be heavily pipe doped, because you want to make sure that you have less issue getting them out later during maintenance, but then also the extended portion of the stud that goes up through the drum flange connection, that also needs to have pipe dope applied to it liberally, so that you get good tensioning or torquing forces during the actual stud to nut connection, but also so that in the future when you want to disassemble the system, again, it becomes easier. So use a lot of thread dope. One brand that comes to my mind is Besto Life. There are a number of them out there. We're always kind of tweaking as an industry which is the correct one to use in this instance. Refer to your IOM manual from your vendor for the latest and greatest one that they're recommending. Or if you do happen to do the specific bolting calculations for your system, it is important to also verify that they're using the friction coefficient with that thread dope brand that you plan to use, because this is a very complicated system, and it turns out the friction between the stud and the nuts is important to the overall joint efficiency. So pay attention to that little detail. Now, when you actually mate these two surfaces up together and you're applying a force with the stud and the nut to squeeze the gasket down properly, it is very important that you tension, not torque the system. So torquing is where you have the torque wrench and you apply a force into the stud to nut assembly which squishes down the gasket to a specific force characteristic. This works very well in most joints that we have to make up in our refinery. However, because this is so big and subject to cyclic stresses, we recommend tensioning over torquing. So tensioning is a also very common process. You've probably seen it around in the hydrocracker or other areas in the refinery, but to properly tension a bolt stud connection, first what you must do is you apply the tensioning system to the top of the stud. the tensioning device goes around this assembly, the stud nut combo, and actually grabs on the stud, so you have to make sure you have enough studs sticking out for this thing to grab on there, and then it actually stretches the bolt out ever so subtly, and then allows you to turn the nut. It should be very easily if you've applied enough pipe dope, as we discussed. You should just turn that nut very easily by hand to where it's seated down onto the flange surface. And then when you release the tensioning device, the stud relaxes, squishes the whole thing down, and you get the perfect amount of force on that gasket. So tensioning is the way to go. It's a little bit more costly, requires a specialized piece of equipment that you can either purchase yourself, or there are lots of outside vendors that have this that they can do during the installation process. So sometimes I will say the word torquing instead of tensioning, but for the purposes of this video and anytime you're discussing this connection, think tensioning, not torquing. That is the most important point. So what are some of the causes of the flange leaks? Now, we already went over out of flatness, out of round. That is something that can obviously cause leaks. We also have issues with differential heating. So again, with the single side entry, that flange connection can be warped or deformed by this uneven heating, and that is something that can cause the gasket surface to relax and potentially get a small leak. We've also experienced some issues with the flange rolls a little bit. So it looks like a very thick flange, but it turns out temperature is a very strong driver in terms of thermal expansion and deflection of this system. So flange roll can be a problem as well. And this is something that can be evaluated using a finite element analysis or a detailed calculation of what's going on with your flange, sort of beyond the scope of this video. But those are some of the things that we've experienced that have caused leaks. And probably one last point here is, of course, not following the manufacturer's tensioning schedule after installation. So I'm going to jump back here a second. I talked about tensioning, not torquing. It's very important that you not only make this joint up properly the first time, it turns out you have to do it 3 more times. So again, these calculations and these situations are evolving over time. Consult your specific vendor, your specific manual, to make sure that you are getting the latest and greatest information. But where we've sort of consolidated around as an industry is retensioning, not torquing, retensioning after approximately 2 to 4 drum cycles, which is usually a couple of days after startup, and then a second time about 2 weeks later. Again, so this is probably after 15, 20 drum cycles, and then a third time about 6 months later. So you got a couple days, a couple weeks, 6 months of retensioning this joint to a very specific set of calculations to make sure that you have the right squeeze on that gasket and the bolts have sort of had the chance to relax. The whole system's kind of settled into its groove, and by doing it stage-wise, you get the best possible success to achieve turnaround to turnaround, leak-free, no issues, don't have to worry about it at all. So make sure that you follow the latest and greatest guidelines from your vendor in terms of how often you need to retension this joint after installation, because it's a lesson that we've learned the hard way. So let's talk about the hard way. If, unfortunately, you have some sort of leaking issue on this connection, there's a pretty good chance that it will just seal itself off. This is a coker after all. We make coke, we make solids, and it's not that uncommon that a tiny, tiny little wispy leak will just seal itself off and nothing is needed to be done. However, that's not exactly something that you want to rely on. It's good to have a plan to fix it right. So unfortunately, retensioning or even retorquing this assembly after you've had a leak, it's probably not going to help because that gasket surface is already compromised. So it might buy you a little bit of time, but it's you're talking weeks or maximum months. It's not going to buy you years of operation, maintenance or headaches free. So retensioning this joint is probably not going to work. If you do have a persistent leak that's, you need to buy yourself some time to get the organizational things set up to fix it properly, applying a steam lance or a steam ring to this system is something that we've done to buy us time, dissipate the gases, dissipate the hydrocarbons that are coming out. It works, but you have to take the proper safety precautions when you're considering that. Now, really, unfortunately, the only way to fix this properly is to drop the bud out of the way, check the gasket surface on the bud, check the gasket surface on the drum, apply a new gasket, and then go through this multi-step tensioning process that I've already described. So it is something that is a serious safety concern, so the best option is to drop it and fix it properly. Now, I do know that on a 2-drum coker, this is a full shutdown. On a 4 or 6-drum unit, this is a module shutdown. There's, of course, a financial impact to this. Hopefully, you can take the opportunity to do some other opportunity maintenance, do some pigging, do some other things during this couple-day outage to do this relatively small job. But we hope this never happens at your site. If it does, feel free to reach out to us at coking.com or contact your licensor or contact the unheading equipment vendor. We all have dealt with this problem, seriously, all over the world. We've helped people try to resolve this issue. So this is considerably a big safety concern. Heck, call all of us. Call me, call the unheading vendor, call the licensor, call everybody to try to get this solution implemented in a way that makes sense for your site and can be done safely and reliably. So thanks for watching this video. I know we did a bit of a deep dive on a very specific topic. However, this is something very coker specific, and this fits well inside our coking.com channel here. And thank you very much. I'm Evan Hyde, your host, and this has been your Tech Nugget. Thank you.